And a few moments ago, sirens were just crossing behind us here. Definitely you get the sense of the city on high alert. There is still some traffic here, but given that this is a European capital on a Saturday night, not what you would expect, it is absolutely astonishing to see Belgian soldiers surrounding hotels. They've asked people not to congregate in the center of town. This morning we were in one of the main shopping districts where some of the few shops there that had opened were very quickly closed by police. And you could see this very
We break away from Nema's story there so we can get you to U.S. President Barack Obama holding a press conference in Kuala Lumpur. Let's listen.
They have been a great success. Earlier this week, as I headed to this region, there was a headline in one of our publications back home that asked, "Obama's Asian distraction?" ? And the premise seemed to be that this region was somehow disconnected from pressing global events. I could not disagree more. This region is not a distraction from the world's central challenges, like terrorism. The Asia-Pacific is absolutely critical to promoting security, prosperity, and human dignity around the world. That's why I've devoted so much of my foreign policy to deepening America's engagement with this region. And I'm pleased that on this trip we made progress across the board. With my fellow leaders from Japan, Australia, and the Philippines, I reaffirmed that our treaty alliances remain the foundation of regional security. The United States is boosting our support for the Philippines' maritime capabilities and those of our regional partners. At the U.S., ASEAN, and East Asia summits, a key topic was the South China Sea. And many leaders spoke about the need to uphold international principles, including the freedom of navigation and overflight and the peaceful resolution of disputes. And to make sure we keep deepening our partnership here in Southeast Asia, I invited all 10 ASEAN leaders to the United States next year. I'm pleased they accepted, and I look forward to continuing our work. On the economic front, we worked with our APEC partners to advance a regional economic order where all nations play by the same set of rules. Based on my meeting with our Trans-Pacific Partnership countries, I am optimistic that our 12 nations will approve this pact and that we can increasingly focus on implementing it. APEC joined the G20 in sending an unequivocal message that we need to reach an ambitious climate change agreement in Paris. I also want to note the landmark step we took this week with more than 30 other nations at the OECD to dramatically reduce subsidies for coal-fired power plants around the world, which is an important way to advance the fight against climate change. Of course, given the events of this week, much of my work here in Asia focused on the urgent threat of terrorism. Today, families in too many nations are grieving the senseless loss of their loved ones in the attacks in France and in Mali. As Americans, we remember Noemi Gonzalez, who was just 23 years old, a design major from California State University. She was in Paris to pursue her dream of designing innovations that would improve the lives of people around the world. And we remember Anita Dutar of Maryland. She's a veteran of the Peace Corps, a mother to her young son who devoted her life to helping the world's poor, including women and girls in Mali, and lift themselves up with health and education. Noemi and Anita embodied the values of service and compassion that no terrorist can extinguish. Their legacy will endure in the family and friends who carry on their work. They remind me of my daughters or my mother, who on the one hand had their whole life ahead of them, and on the other hand had devoted their lives to helping other people. And it is worth us remembering when we look at the statistics that there are beautiful, wonderful lives behind the terrible death tolls that we see in these places. Now, over the years, our friends here in Asia have been victims of terrorism, and many of them are close counterterrorism partners with us. So my time here has also been an opportunity to work with many of our partners in the Asia-Pacific that are members of our coalition against i.s.i.l. Australia, Canada, Japan, Malaysia, New Zealand, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. Which brings me to the point I want to emphasize today. For more than a year, the United States has built and led a broad coalition against ISIL of some 65 nations. Given the frequent focus on America's leadership of this campaign, sometimes the contributions of our partners are overlooked. In fact, since the G20, a number of our coalition members have stepped up with new commitments. So today I want to take a moment to recognize how our allies and partners help advance every element of our strategy. Nearly 24 nations, among them Turkey and our Arab partners, contribute in some way to the military campaign, which has taken more than 8,000 strikes against ISIL so far. And as I've said, we're ready to welcome or cooperate with other countries that are determined to truly fight ISIL as well. 15 countries have deployed personnel to train and support local forces in Iraq. The United Arab Emirates and Germany are organizing 25 coalition partners in helping to stabilize areas in Iraq liberated from ISIL. Italy is coordinating the multinational effort to train Iraqi police. On the political front, U.S. leadership brought all of the key countries together in Vienna to discuss a common understanding on the principles for ending the Syrian civil war. On the humanitarian front, the United States is helping to lead the effort to mobilize more aid for the Syrian people, including refugees. More than 40 countries have now passed or strengthened laws to prevent the flow of foreign terrorist fighters, and 34 nations, including the United States, have arrested foreign terrorist fighters. Saudi Arabia is helping to coordinate the crackdown on ISIL financing. The United Arab Emirates' new messaging center is working to discredit ISIL's propaganda, and Malaysia just announced the creation of its own center to do the same. And by joining our summit at the United Nations that we organized this fall, more than 100 nations, more than 20 multilateral institutions, and some 120 civil society groups, including many leaders from Muslim communities around the world, have become part of a global movement against ISIL and its twisted ideology. All of which is to say that our coalition will not relent. We will not accept the idea that terrorist assaults on restaurants and theaters and hotels are the new normal, or that we are powerless to stop them. After all, that's precisely what terrorists like ISIL want, because ultimately that's the only way that they can win. It's the nature of terrorism. They can't beat us on the battlefield, so they try to terrorize us into being afraid, into changing our patterns of behavior, into panicking, into abandoning our allies and partners, into retreating from the world. And as president, I will not let that happen. In our diverse societies, everybody can do their part, and we will not give in to fear or start turning on each other or treating some people differently because of religion or race or background. That wouldn't just be a betrayal of our values, it would also feed ISIL's propaganda. Their assertion, which is absolutely false, that we must absolutely reject, that we are somehow at war with an entire religion. The United States could never be at war with any religion because America is made up of multiple religions. We're strengthened by people from every religion, including Muslim Americans. So I want to be as clear as I can on this. Prejudice and discrimination helps ISIL and undermines our national security. And so even as we destroy ISIL on the battlefield, and we will destroy them, we will take back land that they are currently in. We will cut off their financing. We will hunt down their leadership. We will dismantle their networks and their supply lines, and we will ultimately destroy them. Even as we are in the process of doing that, we want to make sure that we don't lose our own values and our own principles. And we can all do our part by upholding the values of tolerance and diversity and equality that help keep America strong. The United States will continue to lead this global coalition. We are intensifying our strategy on all fronts with local partners on the ground. We are going to keep on rolling back ISIL in Iraq and in Syria and take out more of their leaders and commanders so that they do not threaten us, and we will destroy this terrorist organization. And we'll keep working with our allies and partners for the opportunity and justice that helps defeat violent extremism. We'll keep standing up for the human rights and dignity of all people, because that is contrary to what these terrorists believe. That's part of how we defeat them. And I'm confident we will succeed. The hateful vision of an organization like ISIL is no match for the strength of nations and people around the world who are united to live in security and peace and in harmony. So with that, I'm going to take a couple of questions. We'll start with Angela Greiling-Keane of Bloomberg. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. President. You're scheduled to meet this week with President Hollande in Washington to talk about stepping up efforts against ISIL even further. Given that Russia would be part of the coalition that France proposes, have you seen any signs in the past couple days of Russia redirecting its military efforts in Syria to actually focus on ISIL? Are there any circumstances that you could see President Assad remaining in power, even if only temporarily, if that's what it took to effectively have a broad alliance directed at ISIL? And finally, as you've said, the U.S. won't work with Russia if their goal is to keep Assad in power. If that's the case, is defeating ISIL or destroying ISIL a realistic goal?
Well, first of all, destroying ISIL is not only a realistic goal, we're going to get it done, and we're going to pursue it with every aspect of American power and with all the coalition partners that we've assembled. It's going to get done. It will be helpful if Russia directs its focus on ISIL. And I do think that as a consequence of ISIL claiming responsibility for bringing down their plane, there is an increasing awareness on the part of President Putin that ISIL poses a greater threat to them than anything else in the region. The question at this point is whether they can make the strategic adjustment that allows them to be effective partners with us and the other 65 countries who are already part of the counter-ISIL campaign. And we don't know that yet. So far, over the last several weeks, when they started taking strikes in Syria, their principal targets have been the moderate opposition that they felt threatened Assad. Their principal goal appeared to be, if you follow the strikes that they took, to fortify the position of the Assad regime. And that does not add to our efforts against ISIL. In some ways, it strengthens it, because ISIL is also fighting many of those groups that the Russians were hitting. When we were in Turkey, I discussed with President Putin in a brief pull-aside his need to recognize that he needs to go after the people who killed Russian citizens. And those aren't the groups that they were currently hitting with strikes. So they're going to have to make an adjustment in terms of what they're prioritizing. More broadly, I've said this before. I said it to President Putin 5 years ago, and I repeated it to him just a few days ago. The issue with Assad is not simply the way that he has treated his people. It's not just a human rights issue. It's not just a question of supporting somebody who's been ruthlessly dropping bombs on his own civilian populations. As a practical matter, it is not conceivable that Mr. Assad can regain legitimacy in a country in which a large majority of that country despises Assad and will not stop fighting so long as he's in power, which means that the civil war perpetuates itself. And so the goal in Vienna is to see if, with all the countries around the table, including Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Iran and Russia, as well as the United States, and other countries that have concerns about this, whether we can arrive at a political transition process that recognizes the need for a new government and can quell the fighting, bring about a ceasefire, and allows all of us to refocus our attention on this barbaric organization that is killing so many people. Russia has not officially committed to a transition of Assad moving out, but they did agree to the political transition process. And I think we'll find out over the next several weeks whether or not we can bring about that change of perspective with the Russians. Keep in mind that we all have an interest in maintaining a Syrian state because we don't want complete chaos. I mean, and there are problems that we've seen in, for example, Lebanon, when the machinery of state entirely breaks down. So there's going to be a need for the international community and the United Nations to work in order maintaining a Syrian state and be able to move forward with a political transition that's orderly. And that's going to be difficult, but that's what we have to focus on. In terms of the position of the United States and the other 65 members of the coalition, my view on Assad is it will not work to keep him in power. We can't stop the fighting. Even if I were to cynically say that my priority is i.s.i.l, and not removing Assad, regardless of the terrible things that he's done to his people, the United States could not stop the fighting in Syria by those who are opposed to Assad's rule. And so this is a practical issue, not just a matter of conscience. And I think that there are a large number of members of this coalition, including President Hollande, who agree with me on that. Okay. Michael Scheer.
Thank you, Mr. President. On a different topic, when you go to Paris next week for the climate talks, you do so in the shadow of what happened in that city a week ago. Could you talk a little bit about how you think those terror attacks might affect the talks? And substantively on the talks, can you talk a little bit about concerns that the United States might not have the ability to convince poor countries that nations will help them pay for what they need to do to achieve the climate talks, given especially the Republican opposition back home? And on one separate matter, could you comment on the investigations that we reported about in our paper this morning into whether or not intelligence officials are altering the assessments of the i.s.i.l campaign to make them seem more rosy?
Yeah. I'll take the last question first. One of the things I insisted on the day I walked into the Oval Office was that I don't want intelligence shaded by politics. I don't want it shaded by the desire to tell a feel-good story. We can't make good policy unless we've got good, accurate, hard-headed, clear-eyed intelligence. I believe that the Department of Defense and all those who head up our intelligence agencies understand that, and that I have made it repeatedly clear to all my top national security advisors that I never want them to hold back. Even if the intelligence or their opinions about the intelligence, their analysis or interpretations of the data contradict current policy. So that's a message that we've been adamant about from the start. I don't know what we'll discover with respect to what was going on at CENTCOM. I think that's something that's best left to the IG and the processes. I have communicated once again to both the chairman of the Joint Chiefs as well as Secretary Carter that I expect that we get to the bottom of whether or not what you described has been happening. There are always going to be some disputes with respect to how to interpret facts on the ground. I get intelligence briefings every single day, and there are times where they're making their best judgments. They'll say with moderate confidence or low confidence or high confidence, this is what we think is happening. There may be times where there are disputes internally among various intelligence agencies about that. But I don't know the details of this. What I do know is my expectation, which is the highest fidelity to facts, data, the truth. And if there are disagreements in terms of how folks are interpreting the facts, then that should be reflected in the reports that we receive. That some folks think this is going on, other folks think that's going on, and that's part of what I weigh in terms of making decisions. One last thing I'll say, though, is as a consumer of this intelligence, it's not as if I've been receiving wonderfully rosy, glowing portraits of what's been happening in Iraq and Syria over the last year and a half. So to the extent that it's been shaded, again, I don't know the details of what's the IG may discover, but it feels to me like, at my level at least, we've had a pretty clear-eyed, sober assessment of where we've made real progress and where we have not. On Paris, a lot of the discussion out here, both at the G20, APEC, and finally here at ASEAN, has been that we've got to get a strong Paris deal. And I'm optimistic that we can. 160 countries have now put forward their national targets for how they can reduce emissions.
All right, listening there to US President Barack Obama. He is in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where the focus is now very much on attacking ISIS. He said there, we will destroy them. We will cut off their financing. We will hunt down their leadership, and we will cut off their supply lines. And he says they are realistic goals, and they will be pursued with the coalition that they've assembled.
And he made a point to support the coalition and mention how supportive it has been in defeating ISIS. Our Summer Mosen was listening to that press conference and will give us an update on the other end of this break. For the both of us, though, we leave you for now.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.